On 23 April 2025, the Calgary Highlanders paraded to commemorate the 110th anniversary of the Battle of Kitchener's Wood. A proclamation was read informing all ranks that the regiment had been redesignated by Ministerial Organization Order 2021021 and was now known as the Calgary Highlanders, 10th Canadians. Many of Canada's infantry regiments have had subsidiary titles added to their formal designations, and this change is just one in a long list of such honorifics. To truly understand the significance of the change, and how this latest name change is in fact very unique in Canadian military history, this video will briefly review the rich history of Canadian Army infantry regiment names. When the Dominion of Canada was established on 1 July 1867, national defence rested partly with British regulars stationed in the country, and partly with the citizen militia composed of male Canadians liable for compulsory service. The Militia Act of 1855 had already created two key components, a permanent active militia, a full-time standing force, and a non-permanent active militia, part-time soldiers who could be mobilized in wartime. Like the British Army on which it was patterned, the Canadian militia was structured around the regimental system, a unique framework where the regiment is not just an administrative unit, but also the custodian of identity and tradition. Regiments were usually rooted in a specific geographic area and had their own name, insignia, and customs, fostering esprit de corps and deep community ties. Tactical units such as battalions or companies were created within this framework, fluctuating in size and number, particularly in wartime. This system is not unlike professional sports branding. The Toronto Maple Leafs of the National Hockey League adopted their name in 1927. While managers, coaches, and players have changed over the years, the team name and familiar logo have endured, building player loyalty and fan identity. Stanley Cup banners, like regimental colors, are enduring reminders of shared heritage and past triumphs. Nobody playing for the Leafs today was alive when Bobby Bonds scored in overtime on a broken ankle during the 1964 Stanley Cup playoffs. Yet feats like that remain central to the team's mythos. This kind of tribal identity functions emotionally but carries real social weight. It binds military units and sports teams to their communities in very tangible ways. On the first day of January 1900, as Canada entered the 20th century, the only permanent infantry unit in the country was the Royal Canadian Regiment of Infantry. The non-permanent active militia, however, was composed of dozens of infantry battalions scattered across the country. On 8 May 1900, all these militia infantry battalions were redesignated by general order to become regiments. Each regiment retained its numbered designation with the exception of the Governor-General's Foot Guards, which by tradition was considered senior to all other infantry regiments. The numbers were awarded in succession according to date of formation. In addition to its number, almost every regiment had a name. The names are shown in the militia list as a subsidiary title enclosed in quotation marks. Other sources set the subsidiary title off in parentheses or simply with a comma. The names usually included some combination of a geographic reference, an honorific or functional title, in some cases a cultural reference. By the turn of the 20th century, the functional titles were purely ceremonial. For example, the 1st Regiment of the Canadian Militia was named the Prince of Wales Fusiliers. The regiment was equipped with the same weapons as all the other infantry regiments. The Fusil was a light flintlock that was phased out by the mid-1800s, and the Prince of Wales Fusiliers did not use them. Other functional titles were equally ceremonial, such as Grenadiers, Rangers, or light infantry. Rifle regiments in the British Army had traditionally trained to fight as skirmishers, clad in dark green rather than fighting in rigid formations like the traditional redcoats. Even after the switch to khaki uniforms, when infantry no longer fought in tight-packed formations, rifle regiments maintained many of their old traditions, such as marching past at the double, carrying their rifles at the trail, and wearing black rank badges and buttons. They also received no ceremonial colors, and their battle honors were emblazoned on their cap badges instead. But like the Fusiliers, Grenadiers, or Rangers, they too trained and fought in the field as regular infantry. Some other examples include the 27th Lambton Regiment, St. Clair Borderers, who were so named for their geographic location at Sarnia, near the American border. The 34th Ontario Regiment was named for the province of Ontario. Other units, like the 32nd Bruce Regiment, took the name of their county. The 35th Regiment, Simcoe Foresters, was named after their county, but also with a nod to the heavy woodlands of the surrounding forests, an honorific title borrowed like the others from British military tradition. The 44th Lincoln and Welland Regiment is named for two different regions, and the 90th Regiment Winnipeg Rifles is named after the city. In August 1914, Canada found itself at war when Britain declared war on Germany. Pre-war plans to mobilize existing regiments for overseas war service were scrapped. Instead, the Canadian Expeditionary Force was created, with numbered infantry battalions formed into 4 divisions that saw combat in France and Flanders. In some cases, these battalions bore the identity of one of the militia regiments in Canada. For example, the 13th, 42nd, and 73rd Battalion CEF all wore the badges of the 5th Regiment Royal Highlanders of Canada, the Montreal regiment that later became the Canadian Black Watch. Some CEF battalions were amalgamations of men from several militia regiments. The 16th Battalion, for example, had companies of the 50th Regiment, 72nd Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, 79th Cameron Highlanders of Canada, and 91st Regiment Canadian Highlanders. The 16th took on an identity of its own when it called itself the 16th Battalion Canadian Scottish. CEF battalions adopted secondary or subsidiary names, usually indicating the geographical area they formed in, or an organizational affiliation. For example, the 18th Battalion had the secondary title Western Ontario, while the 13th Battalion had Royal Highlanders of Canada. The 10th Battalion was formed from men from both the 103rd Regiment Calgary Rifles and the 106th Regiment Winnipeg Light Infantry. Out of a sense of fairness to both localities, the unit simply called itself the 10th Canadians. Eventually, over 250 CEF infantry battalions were formed. The majority had increasingly tenuous links to the militia, and most battalions were broken up for reinforcements. For example, the 10th, 31st, 50th, 56th, 82nd, 89th, and 137th battalions were all raised in Calgary, but not one of them adopted the insignia or traditions of the 103rd Calgary Rifles. Not even the 56th, whose commanding officer, William Charles Gordon Armstrong, had been the driving force in creating the 103rd and had served as its only commanding officer from 1910 to 1916. The creation of new CEF battalions ceased long before the end of the war in favor of a more rational reinforcement system based on reserve battalions whose purpose was specifically as holding units for men needed as reinforcements for the existing CEF battalions at the front. After the First World War ended, Canada was faced with a dilemma. The CEF battalions, which had forged new identities and had actually fought overseas, wanted to be retained in the post-war order of battle. The militia regiments that had provided them with recruits and a high proportion of their officers and NCOs had remained active in Canada throughout the war, training, recruiting, guarding installations, and manning internment camps. In effect, in 1919, Canada had 2 separate armies, but had neither the money or the need to keep them both. Unable and unwilling to keep both the CEF battalions and the militia regiments on the books, the Otter Commission was charged with finding a solution. In 1920, the CEF battalions were disbanded, while all the militia regiments were reorganized. It was long overdue, and the reorganization aimed at rebalancing the militia to ensure a more orderly mobilization for war should the need arise again. As part of this reorganization, the regimental numbers were deleted, and what were formerly subsidiary titles simply became the full official title of the regiment. Many regiments retained their former names, others received new names. For example, the 103rd Regiment Calgary Rifles lost its rifle regiment traditions and became simply the Calgary Regiment. A handful of new regiments had subsidiary titles, and 2 also retained numbers. These regiments included the 1st British Columbia Regiment, Duke of Connaught's Own, the Kingston Regiment, Princess of Wales' Own, the Ottawa Regiment, Duke of Cornwall's Own, the 48th Regiment Highlanders, and the Grenville Regiment, Lisgar Rifles. Of these, only the 48th Highlanders of Canada has retained its numbered designation to the present day. In 1920, the new militia regiments were reliant on veterans of the CEF to bring their valuable wartime experience into this new organization, and out of respect for the identities of the former CEF units, a system of perpetuations was created, with active militia battalions perpetuating the battalions that fought in the trenches, and paper reserve battalions perpetuating all the battalions that had formed and later been broken up for reinforcements. Perpetuation was the system in which the battle honors and histories of the CEF battalions were inherited by the newly reorganized militia regiments. Individual battalions of the new regiments were affiliated with specific battalions of the CEF, and in many cases, the newspapers colloquially referred to the new units by conflating the two. In 1924, the 1st Battalion of the Calgary Regiment was split into its own regiment designated the Calgary Highlanders, but the newspapers continued to call it the 10th Battalion Calgary Highlanders, highlighting the perpetuation of that battalion, which had gained a prestigious reputation as a fighting unit of the 1st Canadian Division. There were other visual links as well, as the unit continued to use 10th Battalion cap and collar badges until its own badges could be minted, and these were heavily influenced by those of the 10th. In fact, some regiments have retained the collar badges of their CEF battalions to this day. The Canadian Scottish Regiment wears the collar badge of the 16th Battalion. The King's Own Calgary Regiment of the Royal Canadian Armoured Corps still wears 50th Battalion collar badges, and the Loyal Edmonton Regiment encourages the use of the nickname 49ers, with the number 49 featured prominently on the cap badge. Newly formed Canadian regiments in the 19th and 20th centuries often patterned themselves after older regiments of the British Army. For example, the 79th Regiment called itself the Cameron Highlanders after the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders, and the 91st Regiment Canadian Highlanders in Hamilton patterned itself on Britain's Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. A system of formal alliances was created. The Canadian Forces Heritage Manual describes these alliances as officially sanctioned links to foster continuous fraternal connections between military organizations beyond the close professional relationships which are always encouraged. In practical terms, the older British regiments provided a model for their Canadian allies in such things as uniforms, insignia, and traditions. And of course, their names. Canadian infantry regiments with strong alliances changed their names to more closely match the British Army regiments that inspired them. The Royal Highlanders of Canada was renamed in January 1930 to become the Black Watch Royal Highlanders of Canada, and in 1935 became the Black Watch Royal Highland Regiment of Canada, to mirror the name of their allied regiment in the British Army. Also worthy of note, the word "the" forms part of the official title of most regiments and is properly capitalized. Some veterans and historians are militant about this, in particular soldiers who have served in the Royal Canadian Regiment and the very similarly named but separate regiment, the Royal Regiment of Canada. And while it is the same for most other regiments, there are exceptions to every rule. In 1934, the Victoria Rifles of Canada deliberately dropped the word "the" to become simply Victoria Rifles of Canada. In 1936, the militia was once again reorganized in an attempt to mechanize and modernize. 3 types of infantry regiments were now approved. For the first time, 2 practical designations were also added. Unlike the purely honorific titles like Fusilier, Grenadier, Forester, etc., the designation is either a machine gun or tank regiment, indicated their specific role, equipment, and training. Thus, the Winnipeg Grenadiers became the Winnipeg Grenadiers, MG, and the Calgary Regiment became the Calgary Regiment, tank. The number of infantry units was greatly reduced in 1936, and rather than disband units altogether, never to be seen again, they were amalgamated. Amalgamation is a process in which the battle honors, history, and traditions of 2 units are combined. Sometimes the new unit simply adopts the name of one or the other, or the name will change to reflect both. For example, the Battleford Light Infantry and the Prince Albert Volunteers amalgamated in December 1936 to become the Prince Albert and Battleford Volunteers. In 1939, Canada mobilized for war in a much more sensible way than it had in 1914, and the militia regiments were used to create battalions for the Canadian Active Service Force, retaining their regimental identities. In late 1940, Canada's land forces were redesignated to become the Canadian Army, divided into active, overseas, and reserve categories. As the Army expanded to an overseas force of 5 divisions, regiments were reorganized according to need. Infantry divisions in 1939 had 3 machine gun battalions. This was reduced by the time the Army went into action into 1 machine gun battalion per division. The biggest change was the creation of the Canadian Armoured Corps in 1940, to which all the former infantry tank battalions were moved. The Army expanded rapidly in the Second World War, and the majority of infantry regiments mobilized battalions for overseas service, as well as full-time home defense duty, while the pre-war part-time units transitioned into reserve battalions. All these battalions bore the name of their parent regiments. Demobilization after the war went smoothly, and another expeditionary force was raised in 1950 using the 3 regiments of the regular army. 6 further battalions were raised for service in Western Europe as part of the new NATO alliance, without adopting the names or insignia of existing regiments. In 1953, immediately after the Korean War, the The Kennedy Board was convened to examine the Reserve Army, as the militia was now known. They recommended a return to the militia name, and a number of infantry units were amalgamated. At the same time, the peacetime army was expanded dramatically to become the largest peacetime standing army in Canadian history. The full-time infantry regiments, Royal Canadian Regiment, PPCLI, and the Vendus, were joined by the Canadian Guards, the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, the Black Watch, Royal Highland Regiment of Canada, and the Canadian Airborne Regiment. In 1964, the Department of National Defence published a guide to the regiments and corps of the Canadian Army. It was a definitive reference outlining the lineage, battle honours, mottos, and sketch histories of each regiment. Students of this topic may note that regiments are rarely listed alphabetically. The military has a very strict order of precedence, or in plain English, seniority list. Each corps has a specific seniority, with cavalry and artillery being superior to infantry, and within the infantry, every regiment also has a precedence, usually based on its date of organization. On 1 February 1968, the Canadian Army was abolished as the three services were integrated in a program called Unification. The Canadian Armed Forces was a unified military. The former Army was reorganized as Mobile Command, later Force Mobile Command, and then Land Force Command. The distinctive uniforms of the Air Force, Army, and Navy disappeared in favor of the CF uniform. The shoulder straps of the dress uniform were removed, and with them the distinctive regimental titles. Individual regiments stubbornly retained their traditions and insignia as best they could. Major reorganizations occurred in the wake of unification. The Canadian Guards was disbanded, considered too British, and the Queen's Own Rifles and Black Watch lost their presence in the permanent forces, now known as the Regular Force. A supplementary order of battle was created for regiments to be put into stasis, existing on paper to be reactivated in time of need. This was seen as preferable to disbandment, and only one regiment has been disbanded in the years since, the Canadian Airborne Regiment in 1993 following the Somalia affair. Only the Halifax Rifles has been reactivated from the supplementary order of battle, being revived in 2009 as an armored reconnaissance regiment. The regiment's name betrays its origins as a rifle regiment in 1860, but in 1946 it was converted to armor and joined the Royal Canadian Armoured Corps. Today, all former infantry regiments in the Royal Canadian Armoured Corps bear the subsidiary title of the Corps, while the former cavalry regiments do not. All infantry regiments belong to the Royal Canadian Infantry Corps, which dates back to 1942. The Corps isn't a field formation, but an umbrella under which training, doctrine, and other policies are managed. Unification began to be undone in the 1980s with a return to distinctive environmental uniforms. Soldiers of the land forces got their shoulder straps back and a short-lived tan summer uniform. In 2011, Land Force Command was renamed the Canadian Army. The addition of a subsidiary title, an extension of the unit's formal name, usually added in parentheses, is not in any way unusual, as many Canadian infantry regiments have been granted them over the years. In 1948, the Canadian Scottish Regiment added Princess Mary's to their designation. An ill-advised plan to closely associate militia regiments with regular force units saw the loyal Edmonton Regiment receive the subsidiary title 3rd Battalion PPCLI. In 1970, it was changed to 4th Battalion PPCLI when a 3rd Regular Battalion was added. Likewise, in 1954, the London and Oxford Fusiliers received the subsidiary title 3rd Battalion, the Royal Canadian Regiment. Then they renumbered as the 4th, and in 1989 dropped the name of the regiment altogether to become simply 4th Battalion, the Royal Canadian Regiment. In October 2000, the Toronto Scottish was granted the subsidiary title Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother's Own, to recognize the long association with Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, who became Colonel-in-Chief of the regiment in 1937 and held the position to her death in 2002. In August 2013, the Cameron Highlanders of Ottawa were granted the subsidiary title Duke of Edinburgh's Own, likewise honoring a long-serving Colonel-in-Chief, in this case Prince Philip, who held the appointment from 1967 to his death in 2021. There are many other examples of subsidiary titles, usually referencing a unit affected by an amalgamation or a connection to the royal family or an honorary Colonel-in-Chief. In the case of the Calgary Highlanders, 10th Canadians, however, it is the first time a regiment has officially incorporated the designation of a First World War infantry battalion as part of its name. This has been of necessity a very brief overview, and some topics were overlooked completely, such as the naming conventions of the wartime parachute battalions. Those interested in the lineage of today's Canadian Army regiments can find a complete accounting at the Government of Canada's website under National Security and Defence, Canadian Armed Forces, Military History, History and Heritage, Official Lineages. A link is provided in the video description. This channel's namesake website, canadiansoldiers.com, also lists the Canadian Army's infantry regiment names, sorted by date and tracing their lineage through the 20th century. Those links are also in the description. The regimental system remains a powerful and emotionally resonant framework, forging lasting connections between Canadian soldiers, their communities, and the storied legacy of the Canadian Army in both war and peace.